All right, welcome back. I hope that you've enjoyed these first two chapters and are ready to move on with the past simple. So, the definition of the past simple, as you can see, is this next slide. It states the simple past, or the past simple, expresses an action in the past taking place once, never, or several times. It can also be used for actions taking place one after another or in the middle of another action. So those last two are a little different than what we've seen so far, and we'll kind of focus our attention on those, but again, we'll see that a little later on in this video. So as you can see here, in the upper left corner, you can see that I've included a little table. And the first part of the table says all tenses. Now let me explain. What I'm meaning is this doesn't include all the tenses in the past, but the past simple tense is used in many different examples. For example, in the perfect tenses, the verbs are conjugated in the simple past. So that's one example. And so it is many use cases outside of its own grammatical section, if that makes any sense. Again, you'll kind of understand a little later on. It can be a little confusing, but I don't mean to say that all past tenses are structured this way, just so that stays clear. So I'm going to break this down real quick. Again, I'm going to go over this into a little more detail later on, and we'll see a few examples. But as you can see, the positive sentence, which states I spoke, is only a pronoun and a verb. So that is how a positive sentence generally is formed. It's just a pronoun, a verb, and you can also finish off with a noun or more context, but it's pretty bare. Now, to form a negative sentence, we have to include the phrase did not. So the sentence reads, I did not speak. So the fact that we included did not means that our verb is going to be infinitive. So the did not takes the place of the past simple grammatically. And the same goes with the question. We have to start our question with did, which means that the verb is also going to stay in its infinitive form, as did takes the need of the past simple. So again, I'll go over that into a little more detail later on, but to keep that in mind. So now we're going to move on to the exceptions. So some of these exceptions are very similar to some of the exceptions that we'll see later on in other grammatical tenses, as well as a few that we've seen in the present progressive, for example. So in the first case, it reads, after a final E, only add D. Oh, I'm sorry. So just to start off, the general rule is that we have to add an ED at the end of each word. So the first exception states after a final E, only add D. So if we look at our example, the word love ends with an E. So instead of just adding ED, so we'd have EED, that looks kind of strange. So we only add a D. So love turns to loved. Now, the second exception states that after a final consonant, after a short stressed vowel, or L is final consonant after a vowel is doubled. So let's break that down. So when our word ends with a consonant, and right before that consonant there is a short stressed vowel, or if the consonant is an L, we must double that consonant. So let's look at our first example. We have the word admit. So admit ends with a short stressed vowel, the I, so the final consonant, which is a T, needs to be doubled. So we double the T and then add on ED. So we get admitted with double T, or two T's. Now let's look at the next. It says travel. So if we notice, in this case it ends with a short stressed vowel, the E, but it might not be stressed, but it ends with an L. So since it ends with an L, a vowel and then L, the L has to be doubled as well. So we get traveled with double L and we add on the ED. Now, just a side note, that is only in British English. Again, we'll see this a few times, so I'll also stress this later on. But I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment about that difference. And the final exception in spelling states that the final Y after a consonant becomes an I. So when our word ends with a consonant and then a Y, so in our example we have hurry, so we have an R and then a Y, both are consonants. So when we conjugate this into the simple past, we have to change the Y to an I. So we drop the Y, add an I and then add on the ed, and we get hurried. So we're going to see a few examples of this later on, but those are the three exceptions. Now if we go to the bottom left corner, we have a little tip that says irregular verbs in the past are all too numerous, and the only way to learn them is through diligent studies and memorization. Strive to focus on words that are common and keep studying hard. So I've used this phrase a number of times, irregular verbs. So you might be asking yourself, what is an irregular verb? So in the simple past, we have many of what we call irregular verbs. And an irregular verb is a verb that when conjugated doesn't follow the general grammar rules or any of the exceptions. So if we look at that first table in the top left corner, we have the word spoke. So that comes from the infinitive, which is to speak. But instead of adding on an ed and saying speaked, that sounds a little funny. So this word is conjugated completely different. As you can see, it's written completely different, and there's no rule. If you ask me, well, why is it spoke? My answer will be because it is. Why the people who created the English grammar made it that way, I don't know. But there are hundreds of irregular verbs, and these are verbs that don't follow any rule. So the only way to learn them is to memorize them. That is one of the reasons why reading is so important to truly learn and grasp the English grammar, because there are so many exceptions, and on top of that, there are many irregular verbs, and truly the only way to truly learn them is to be exposed. Now, there are many common words that we use often, and those I advise that you make a table and you study and you do your very best to memorize them. But I wouldn't say go out and memorize with the table all of the irregular verbs, because there are far too many. But with reading and time and exposure, you will grasp onto this concept. But it's extremely important and one of the biggest stumbling blocks in learning English. But don't get discouraged. It's not as hard as you think. So just keep on working with that. And lastly, I'd just like to quickly touch a few of the signal words in the past simple. I've included a few examples such as yesterday, 2 minutes ago, in 1990, the other day, last Friday. If you'll notice, all of the examples focus on the duration of time, specifically on the time frame. So that's just something to keep in mind. So here I've included just the basic sentence structure of the pronoun, a verb conjugated in the past, and you can have a noun or the subject or the context that follows later. But that's the basic conjugation, and we can remember if we are forming a negative sentence, we include did not before the verb, and the verb stays in its infinitive form, as well as a question. We have to start our question with did, and again, the verb will stay in its infinitive form. But those are just side notes, and we will see those later on in the examples. So now we're going to break down that definition. So let's take that first piece. That states an action in the past taking place once, never, or several times. So the example reads, he visited his parents every weekend. So we can see we have our pronoun, the verb, which is conjugated in the simple past. We have our subject, his parents, and every weekend. So that's the time frame, or the repetition. So it was every weekend, which would correspond to several times. Now let's move on to the following point. It says actions in the past taking place one after the other. So the example reads, he came in, took off his coat, and sat down. So we have three actions that are in a list format, correct in one sentence, and which means that they are one after the other. So first, he came in. After he entered or came in, he took off his coat, and then he sat down. So they are successive actions. And if you focus on the verbs, such as came in, took off, sat down, all the verbs, the three actions, the verbs, are all conjugated in the past simple. So this is something that we use quite often, and it's something that's useful about the past simple. So that's something to take note of and to remember. And the following part of our definition is an action in the past taking place in the middle of another action. So this one's a little more difficult, a little more confusing, so we're going to break this down, and hopefully I can explain it well enough that you can understand. So the example reads, when I was having breakfast, the phone suddenly rang. So first thing I want to point out, we have a comma in the sentence, so we can think of the first part and the second part. So I would like you to imagine that the first part is the inner part of the sentence, and the second part is the outer part. Okay? So the main action would be the first part, the inner part. So when I was having breakfast, or in the middle of eating breakfast, the phone suddenly rang. So the phone rang while I was having breakfast. And so that interrupted my breakfast. That's something that happened while I was eating. So that action, the phone ringing, is taking place in the middle of me eating breakfast. So this is something where we use the past simple. And the last thing that I'd just like to mention, so you can have it in mind, you can take notes. I'm not going to explain it into too much detail because it's advanced grammar that we don't need to know at the moment. But the if sentences type 2, or an if clause, which is a grammatical structure in English, is also included in the past simple. So the example says, if I had a lot of money, I would share it with you. So these are if clauses. So we use if, which is something that is conditional, right? So if I had a lot of money, implying that if I did, I may or may not, but if I did, I would share some with you. So it is an action, something I would do if a condition was met. So that's just a side note. Don't get too confused about that. Like I said, it's pretty advanced grammar for later on. And now we're going to move on to a few of the examples. So I split the examples into 3 columns. We have our affirmative, negative, and our questions. So let's start off with these affirmative sentences. So the first one says, she kissed me on the cheek. It rained yesterday. I watched TV all night. So these are pretty basic. Again, we have our pronoun, our verb in the past simple, and then our context, or noun later on after that. Now let's move on to the negative sentences. So if we remember, we have our pronoun followed by did not, and then the verb that follows must be in the infinitive form, okay? Because did not takes the place of the present past grammatically. So these examples read, they did not go running this morning. She didn't lose any weight last week. We didn't do our group project. So one of the things I just want to point out, we have did not and didn't. Again, these are contractions. So far in this course, we've only seen them used in negative sentences. There are other use cases, but for now we'll only use them in negative sentences. They have the same meaning. It is just a way to say these things in a shorter, quicker way. And lastly, we're going to move on to our questions. So the questions must start with did, which also takes the place of the past simple grammatically, leaving our verbs in the infinitive form. So some of these questions say, did I walk the dog last night? Did you prepare your presentation? Did John get sick over the weekend? So again, these are pretty simple. You can pause the video and write them down, break it down, use the framework that I've given you, study exactly what is a pronoun, what is a noun, what is a verb. Those are things you can easily find on the internet or study at home that will help you be able to break these down into parts, and you can go over it a little more detailed on your own. Now, to finish off, I've included a few media items for you. On the left, we have an image that includes a few of the differences in the present and the past tense. So we just got into the past tense. So just to do a little bit of a review, help you to organize your thoughts and see some of the differences and the difference in the use cases. And on the right, I've included a little quiz for you that I'd like you to complete in your notebooks that you have with you throughout this video. So I hope that you can enjoy these resources. Take your time, no pressure, and I will include the answers later on. So thank you for your time. I hope that you have enjoyed this lesson and have a good rest of the chapter. So I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.